My channel is sponsored by Geology this month, which means we'll have an ad from them somewhere in the middle of today's video. Unless I've changed the title of this video by the time that you're seeing this, sort of needs no introduction. Pretty literal. I asked 20 game developers about the Stop Killing Games initiative to get actual game developer perspectives on the petition, how realistic or not the suggestions within it are, and just the general sense of things that they do or don't like about it. Now, I am covering this a bit late because, like, 2 days after I did these interviews, there was a whole new wave of drama surrounding the topic, and I just very much wanted to avoid having any part of that. But I will give you some context. So before we get into what the devs had to say, in case you've somehow never heard of this at all, and you're currently just extremely confused about what I'm talking about, in the creator's own words, Stop Killing Games is a consumer movement started to challenge the legality of publishers destroying video games that they have sold to customers. The website continues, an increasing number of video games is sold effectively as goods with no stated expiration date, but designed to be completely unplayable as soon as support from the publisher ends. This practice is a form of planned obsolescence and is not only detrimental to customers, but makes preservation effectively impossible. Furthermore, the legality of this practice is largely untested in many countries. Basically, the goal is to prevent publishers from being able to take video games that people have bought and paid for offline, making them unplayable. The creators are asking for a version of any game that you have bought to still be playable even after the publisher stops supporting it. The movement's EU petition amassed 1,400,000 signatures. The UK petition got almost 200,000 signatures. Because of the crazy volume of signatures, various governing bodies do have to consider the issue for debate, and according to the Stop Killing Games website, the movement has successfully escalated complaints on this problem to consumer agencies in France, Germany, and Australia, and have brought forth petitions for new law on this problem to various countries. They said, as of 2025, most consumer action on this matter has concluded, and we are waiting decisions on it from several governments. But there have been a bunch of questions about how feasible any of this is, and a whole internet saga, the aforementioned drama with a popular streamer known as Pirate Software, very heavily criticizing the movement and then receiving a lot of backlash for doing so.
I have been called a corporate plant, degenerate, narcissist, nepo baby, and many other names, and they attacked all the accomplishments over my life, despite physical evidence to prove to the contrary. And they also went after every job I ever held, trying to say that I never worked them, or if I did work them, that I never deserved them. So I'm going to be honest with you. I hope that your initiative gets everything you asked for, but nothing you wanted.
I also personally don't really have a lot of opinions of my own to share of this of any value, really, which is why I asked a bunch of other game devs about it. I asked people with varying degrees of experience, AAA, indie, multiplayer, single player, MMOs, hero shooters, you name it. I really tried to get as much broad spectrum information as possible, and because of that, I find it really especially interesting where the answers overlap significantly. But yes, worth noting, almost nothing I'm about to say is my opinion, except for this word from our sponsor. So we'll get to the answers after this. If there's one stat that you've been neglecting in your personal wellness skill tree, I actually wouldn't blame you if it was skincare. And not because it's not important, it is, but because it can be extremely overwhelming. At least that's what I thought before I found Geology. Geology is a 41-time award-winning skincare, hair care, and body care company featured in Men's Health, Esquire, Oprah Daily, and they have over 10,000 five-star reviews because they did something seemingly nobody else has been able to do, which is make skincare easy. There is no one-size-fits-all with skincare, and Geology knows that. So they start with a super simple 60-second quiz about your skincare goals or concerns, whether it's dry skin, acne, dark circles, or oiliness. You take the quiz, and Geology builds you a personalized dermatologist-grade routine that ships right to your door. Their products are backed by actually proven ingredients, dermatologist approved, and one thing I particularly love is they don't have this huge list of ingredients or additives that so many skincare products seem to have. They just keep it simple. This has just got 3. So use my link and code and grab 80% off your personalized skincare trial set. Plus you get a free gift and up to 80% off of add-ons. Trust me, your skin will thank you. Now back to the video. Okay, so there are 2 things that the developers that I asked about Stop Killing Games agreed on almost unanimously. The first, game devs would really like it if their games were playable forever. They would love it if the thing that they worked on was prevented from disappearing because some publisher decided to shut it down. One developer said that 99% of the games that they'd worked on in their career are no longer available or playable, which is insane. That's so much creative labor to just have disappear, and the creator doesn't even have to be told about it. And on that note, I'm going to start this with an important quote from Emma Kidwell, an award-winning game dev currently working at Firaxis. She said, and pretty much every single person that I spoke to echoed some version of this, "Game developers love making games. We love playing games, and nothing breaks our hearts like corporate greed and profits killing our hard work and a player's enjoyment of them. I promise you, we aren't the ones behind any long-lasting awful decisions being made. We don't want it either. We're on your side. We want to make things you'll buy and keep until we all turn to dust." Which, woo! Go Emma! Thank you. Obviously, if you're not new to my channel, you'll have heard me rant many times about how game devs and publishers are two very different things, but it does feel like it's worth pointing out and repeating over and over and over and over again, because far too many people still equate the two. And with that, virtually all of the developers wanted the initiative to succeed. Literally only one person was strongly against it, and even that was because of the specific technicalities of the games that their studio is making. So I ask that you remember this regarding everything I'm about to tell you. It wouldn't be fair for me to include quotes that focus on some of the complications or like criticisms or just questions without really highlighting these developers were overwhelmingly in support of stop killing games and hope that it succeeds in some form. Which, the second unanimous thing, everyone agreed that this is extremely complicated and, as exists with many facets of game dev, way harder than most people seem to think, outside of a few small circumstances. Even the people who were most enthusiastically loud about their support expressed some frustrations that people across the internet were excessively simplifying things. Not the creator of the initiative himself, I do want to be clear about that, but people in surrounding conversations were making things sound way easier than they actually are. So let's get into that. I directly asked a group of devs how difficult they thought it would be to implement an ability to just allow players to continue playing an online game after a studio has taken servers offline, and the answers amounted to depends on the game and how much of the game needs to be playable, and then ranged from easy for this type of game and impossible for this type of game. It was a spectrum. There's just a ton of variability. Thankfully, Stop Killing Games is not retroactive. They are not asking devs to update existing games because honestly, that would actually genuinely probably crash the entire industry. That's not even an exaggeration. Like in some cases, it would straight up be impossible, functionally, technically impossible. In the others, it would be so expensive that everything would burn to the ground. But for new games, as in games that are not already in development, like it's things that would be starting development post-petition, most devs agreed that it was actually fairly simple as long as they knew ahead of time. Here is an exact quote from one of these devs. This is from Maxwell Kunze, who is a level designer and Unity generalist at Team Nemo. He said, "It would be as simple as just setting up private server hosting from the get-go. It's not necessarily a free add-in, it would take some time and testing, but if we think about it in terms of regular testing, we already have a responsibility to ensure that we are selling a game that reasonably functions, doesn't break your computer or console, and doesn't introduce any new security risks to your computer. I think those are already fair expectations a consumer should have of a product they buy, so while it may be a not insignificant amount of extra work, it's not unprecedented, and it's not exponentially any harder than the other responsibilities I've mentioned." Consensus is yeah, as long as you develop with the thing in mind to begin with, it's doable. And this applies to virtually every facet of game development, to be clear, as long as you are making something with this stuff in mind from the beginning. This is definitely really important in terms of video game accessibility. It's much, much, much easier to do. Now, I also wanted to include this example from Zach Johnson, a senior software engineer who has worked on a number of Blizzard games, just because I thought the specifics were really interesting. He said, "For Warcraft 3 Reforged and Diablo 2 Resurrected, we had command line arguments we could provide to internal builds that could bypass online authentication, authorization, and other facets of DRM. This would allow the player to continue playing all offline functionality, such as custom games in Warcraft 3 Reforged or single-player characters in Diablo 2 Resurrected. It would take a single developer less than a week to change the code to make that the default behavior, get QA to test the change and ensure the game works otherwise, and release it to players as a final end-of-life build. And a week is a conservative estimate, but everything in game dev takes 3 times longer than you think." MMOs and mobile games are sort of an exception to this, interestingly enough, and mobile games specifically feel like a very under-discussed part of this whole thing. Mobile games have traditionally just been allowed to delist themselves anytime they like Flappy Bird, for example, famously being pulled down after like tremendous, insane success because the creator felt guilty about how addictive it was and was concerned about overusage. This was in a period of time where he was making, reportedly, $50,000 per day from that game, by the way, even though it was a free game. But basically, this can be a core design issue for mobile games and MMOs, like games that are dependent on consistent updates and microtransactions as part of their like design ethos, like gacha games, become a completely different game if you take them offline. John Ryan, who is a senior narrative designer who has worked for multiple AAA studios, used a game called Lily's Garden as an example, saying, "What does the gameplay experience look like when you allow people to continue playing a game that is designed with online functionality in mind, but let them play it offline? You'd have to imagine what the gameplay experience would be online versus offline from the very genesis of the game. Can you have the same experience? How would it be built? Would you be making two games at that point?" It could basically make it more difficult to design these games at all, depending on what the legislation would actually be asking for. There's also a whole slew of complications with the way that the App Store functions, like what is qualified as a game on the App Store. That's not even that simple. Do games that are more akin to experiences count? Who knows? There are a few more highly specific concerns. A big one is external dependencies. Studios that use third-party services that must be paid for. Mike Wuetherick, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Mike, the chief technical officer at Mega Crush Interactive, said, "Many studios use third-party services such as PlayFab to provide back-end services for their game. Building a game that is dependent on third-party services like this means that it is literally impossible to operate unless someone is paying for the services." Similarly, Iván León, who is a senior AI/gameplay programmer, said, "Something that I have seen surprisingly repeated many times is the concept of just distributing binaries to keep the game accessible, when in reality only a few companies can afford that. Most games nowadays, even those developed with in-house engines, rely on third-party tools, Fmod, Havok, Speedtree, for different goals. When you get one of those licenses to use their libraries in your project, that license does not include the right to distribute that code, which, among many more things, is what comes in said binaries." Stop Killing Games is not asking for studios to pay for servers or third-party services indefinitely. For the record, that is not an ask at all, not even a little bit. But as Mike is saying, if your game just straight up doesn't function without a particular third-party tool, that has to be paid for on an ongoing basis. And in that case, the legislation would sort of force you to keep paying, which is not sustainable for almost any studio, certainly not any indie studio. There were two other devs who shared similar sentiments that Stop Killing Games would likely prevent them from using certain third-party services that they currently use quite often, because their games are built knowing that they can rely on those and pay for them for as long as the game is profitable, aka people are still buying it and playing it. I guess the solution would be for all developers to just stop using any of these third-party services for any new games in development, which is not impossible, but also, you know, a noteworthy consideration. This would have a pretty tremendous impact on the industry on many scales, and it's a big hurdle for teams who are used to developing with this technology in mind. They might have to learn a whole new skill set, which takes time, which actively costs development money. One developer who asked to remain anonymous explicitly told me that being unable to use these third-party tools or companies would likely shut down some studios and could otherwise make funding much, much, much more difficult for multiplayer indie games due to potential added development costs for teams who just don't already have the experience with this kind of thing. Like, it is an added cost because they don't have experience with other tools. RuneScape was a really, really interesting example in the damages due to dependencies sort of category. Fred Horgan, a senior technical director currently at Astrid Entertainment, also worked on RuneScape, which is an MMO that runs entirely on in-house tech. Again, he also noted that the initiative is not retroactive, but I felt like this tidbit was worth sharing regarding design complications specifically. It's really interesting. He said of RuneScape, "Its heavy use of bespoke tech design specifically to run RuneScape in a known environment means getting it to run outside of this environment could be extremely complicated. For an existing game like RuneScape, this isn't an issue. However, it means that Jagex's in-house engine may become unsuitable for future projects purely because of assumptions made way before the initiative existed." Basically meaning that this studio and many others might have to make a whole new engine for any future games because their previous ones were not built with this initiative in mind, or even really considered because they can't see the future. But even in instances where it seemed like it was actually functionally, technically, fairly, again, simple to allow online games to remain playable without needing ongoing developer or publisher support, there were just a ton of questions about which version of things should or should not exist, and just how complicated that might be legally. These questions were not directed at the creator of Stop Killing Games, again, to be clear, who may have their own answers. The questions were much more focused about how it would actually look in any governmental or legal proceedings. What are the courts actually going to be asking game devs for? If there's an update for League or Apex or Valorant or Overwatch or whatever else, would that prevent it from being retroactive? Most of those games aren't set up to be hostable for individual players, making that really, really difficult. And about games like these, a systems designer who worked at a AAA studio who was asked to remain anonymous asked, "How on earth do you word that legally in a way that doesn't allow publishers to find loopholes and exploits?" Which I actually think is a really great point. They continued, League of Legends isn't affected since it came out before the bill was passed. Publishers know that, and my concern is that we'll just start seeing more games turned into live services, kind of like how Call of Duty does it. A series like Assassin's Creed could become a single ongoing platform where new entries are just paid updates or DLC instead of full new games. It seems like it would be a fairly easy way for really big juggernaut studios to get around the new rules, but it feels like a loss for players, especially with how tired people already are of live service games and juggling a bunch of different launches. Which, quick side note, a lot of these developers shared speculative concerns about some of the ways that publishers might respond. 3 separate devs said that they expected that publishers would very likely massively increase everybody's favorite thing, microtransactions, specifically in things like sports games, which would sort of no longer be able to release annually to try to recoup any potential revenue loss or use it as an excuse to increase them. And they're against this, to be clear. This is the part where I tap the sign. Game developers and publishers are different, and devs are very much on the public side regarding disliking publishers' shitty, greedy practices, even if they are forced to implement some of them. Okay? Anyway, sorry, back to the what version of this game has to exist and how much of it needs to be playable questions that are hard to avoid talking about when talking about MMOs. One developer brought up Wrath of the Lich King as an example. Blizzard has technically killed that version of the game, so how do you differentiate between versions which can or cannot be, like, killed, legally speaking? These things will have to find explicit legal definitions, and that's just going to be really hard. On this, Kevin O'Brien, who is a senior QA manager at Theorycraft Games, asked, if it's just the core gameplay and none of the thrills, then it might not be that bad for a game like League of Legends or Valorant to be playable without the platform. The developer could release the game on a client-specific version and a matching game server with some basic instructions on how to run the game server. Or maybe it needs to be doable for a normal consumer to get it running, in which case the bar would be way higher. Another challenge would be that the game server expects to receive certain information from the platform. Who are the players? Which character did they select to play? Which cosmetics are they using? Which team are they on, etc. I expect the server would just fail to function until you either modify that code or provide it the information it's looking for. Which, yeah, for things like this, there are basically a lot of questions about, like, what level of technical understanding or know-how is expected to be expected from players. Like, does a casual console gamer need to easily be able to run an MMO that no longer has publisher server support without any technical knowledge? Like, someone who has never set up a custom server in their life, do they need to be able to know how to do this? How easy does it have to be? Which I guess ties into the next point. There were some public criticisms about the petition being way too vague. And while I suspect that that's where a lot of the devs' questions are inherently coming from, many of the devs that I interviewed said that they felt that it was worded as well as it possibly could be, considering the complexity of the ask. One developer said, I feel like the language in the petition can't possibly be specific enough to capture all of the nuance of different technologies at play. Which is fair. It's sort of impossible to be hyper-specific about an industry that just has so much variability. And it's not on Stop Killing Games as an initiative to figure out all the answers or come up with all of the definitions. Like, they haven't presented a technical document. That is on the legislating bodies, like I keep saying. And yeah, they're certainly just in for a real tough time regarding MMOs and live service games specifically. More than one developer, again, who was still actually supportive of the initiative overall, believed it was likely to fail to get through Parliament entirely just because it's so complicated, and government officials certainly aren't going to know anything about the complexities of video game infrastructure, which is a valid cause for concern. And one very common just outright criticism, maybe the only one that game devs shared of Stop Killing Games that doesn't fit in the, like, I just have a lot of questions about this category, was part of the website's FAQ specifically. There is a question that reads, wouldn't this be a security risk for video game companies? And the FAQ states, not at all. In asking for a game to be operable, we're not demanding internal code and documentation, just a functional copy of the game. It would be no more of a security risk than selling the game in the first place. Numerous developers did not agree with this one, and I think part of that is tied into a public misunderstanding of technical terms like security, like what security means in context of video games or software. Most people think hacking or vulnerabilities, protecting against unauthorized access. And while that is part of it, there were some concerns basically because it's overall much bigger than that. Zach Johnson, who we heard from a little bit earlier, said, this initiative is absolutely a security risk for companies. A contrived example, someone runs a Halo 2 server that kicks all players who join that don't have slurs in their usernames. PC Gamer writes an article associating Halo 2 with servers that contain slurs. The mother of a gamer reads this article in passing and assumes Microsoft is enabling this behavior rather than being unable to stop it due to players running their own standalone servers. He continued, I'm not saying this is how I want things to be. I want the Stop Killing Games initiative to succeed. There are some legitimate security concerns that companies will have in regards to allowing their intellectual property to exist outside of their immediate purview. The job description of what we call Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO, should help to clarify just how much shit these guys are thinking about in terms of security. Basically, it also encompasses brand risks. But there are actually also some positives that you may not have expected. Multiple developers mention that if this passes, publishers will effectively be forced to financially support some of their ideas, particularly the kinds of things that are routinely rejected. Matthew, a developer from Ubisoft, said, "I remember working on a game where user passwords and IPs were stored in a simple database without any kind of encryption. Since RGPD, which is a separate legislation, passed, when bosses asked to do that sort of things, us devs can say that's illegal and force our bosses to give us time to do things properly. If this initiative succeeds, our offline mode ideas will not stay on the design whiteboard, our bosses will have to let us implement them." I can imagine that's especially nice for somebody who works at Ubisoft. Like, that rules. And to continue on the positives, Maxwell Kunze, who was mentioned earlier, said, "In some cases, it may make development time quicker. Right now, there are some games that are online only, even during their single-player experiences. Stop Killing Games would discourage that kind of functionality, so if the publisher decides that it no longer makes the online-only single-player functionality worth it, suddenly that's a bit less work that needs to be added towards that single-player content. But let's be real, there are scarcely any good reasons to make a single-player game require the internet." And he's totally right. I don't know if there are any good reasons. Like, do you remember when you just used to put a cartridge in a console and a game ran? You used to be able to just like insert a disc and play a video game. And now you have to download everything on top of putting a disc in. Like, I can't believe what they've taken from us. It's insane. On that note, when I asked about game preservation in general, almost everybody agreed that the current state just sucks ass. And they're really glad that someone is making an effort to fix the ass-suckiness. Admittedly, a few of them just didn't care that much about game preservation, especially like considering the tremendous volume of video games that exist, which, fair enough, to each their own. Now, I could keep going. I could make this video an hour long. Like, every single one of these developers gave me incredibly detailed answers, and I am so thankful for their time. Like, several apologized for giving me such lengthy responses, which I think is how you know that they care, and they really do. Again, my takeaway from this is that literally all devs dislike what publishers are doing insofar as like taking games offline or preventing games from being playable, including the games that they personally play. It sucks. It's not fair for customers. It's bad. It should be changed. But I do also get the impression that there are just some frustrations regarding Stop Killing Games, more so the broader conversation on the internet, overly simplifying how this would work. It is complicated. It's expected to be very complicated in court. As said, some people think it could be impossible, or at least many of the questions raised here will be answered throughout a very lengthy process by design. But that said, virtually everyone is glad that someone is trying to make a difference. Like I said, like, no one wants things the way that they are, it's just that the solution is complicated. I think that Horgan put it very well when they said, "The initiative is already fairly hefty in what it's trying to achieve. If anything, I think the wide net it's trying to cast may end up causing a lot of headaches when it comes to actual legal discussions. I genuinely hope that we at least get some sort of conversation started around the topic of terminating live games and the implications it has on preservation as a whole. Even if nothing tangible comes directly from the initiative itself, it will hopefully open some doors that we can take in the future to help game preservation in some way."